MTC 2.20. Even though economists are generally trying to measure the short-term societal benefits of more tangible and immediate research, selecting a lag time is merely a choice of analytical convenience. There were decades between the development of quantum physics and technologies based on quantum theory, transistors, lasers, magnetic resonance imaging, and so on. The theory is over a century old, and yet new technologies, such as quantum computers, are still in development. It would be hard to argue that these were impractical or unimportant benefits that could be left out of a realistic benefits assessment. It would seem even a field of research that has yet to yield useful results should not be dismissed as long as it still has intellectual inspirational value. One never knows what is yet to transpire. Likewise, how does one measure the benefits of long-term research that may require decades to yield significant findings? MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.21. Russ Hansen famously said, "All seeing is seeing as." Russ Hansen. While Hansen's focus was upon the interaction between scientific theories and their corresponding observations, his dictum clearly applies in everyday contexts as well. Hansen. As he noted, seeing a bird in the sky involves seeing that it will not suddenly do vertical snap rolls. To see an object in the sky as a bird is to see the object knowingly, to see it as potentially flapping its wings, but not as potentially maneuvering like a fighter plane. His point is completely general. We do not see patches of color, vague figures, outlines, surfaces, and edges. What we do see is a world of definite objects. Presumably visual sensation consists of the aforementioned patches of color, vague figures, and so on, but seeing the visual experience does not. Seeing consists of observing the world as peopled by objects. Objects, in this case, are interpretations of our sensory experience. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Using arts to enhance children's enjoyment and understanding of mathematical concepts and skills, can help students gain access to mathematics through new intelligences. 2.22. For example, music, linked with musical intelligence, visual arts, linked with spatial intelligence, dance, linked with bodily kinesthetic intelligence, and drama, linked with linguistic intelligence, all can be used to promote the development of intellectual domains of mathematics. Different forms of art can enable students to use different learning styles and prior knowledge, pulling together diverse cognitive and affective experiences and organizing them to assist understanding. 142. As an application of multiple intelligences theory, teaching mathematics integrated with arts facilitates students to complete the process of knowledge transfer. As a result, students whose strengths lie in areas other than the logical mathematical intelligence can learn mathematics more easily. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.23. Genetic engineering is likely to further diminish the role of the farmer. Genetically engineered, GE, seeds are designed to be grown in a large-scale agricultural system in which farmers become laborers or renters of seed technology. Desperate to increase their yields to make up for low prices, many U.S. farmers have adopted the high-yielding GE seeds. In doing so, they have been forced to sign contracts legally binding them to use proprietary chemicals on their transgenic crops and in some cases to permit random inspections of their fields by biotechnology company representatives who check that farmers are not saving and reusing the licensed seed. Despite the premium farmers pay for high-tech seeds, they receive no warranty for the performance of these seeds as the contracts protect biotechnology seed companies in the event of seed failures. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.24. The fact that babies can experience basic emotions reflects the early emergence of biologically rooted emotional brain systems that include the limbic system and the brainstem. Significant advances in emotional development occur during infancy and childhood as a result of changes in neurobiological systems that can exert control over the more primitive limbic system. As children develop, maturation of the cerebral cortex allows a decrease in unpredictable mood swings and an increase in the self-regulation of emotion, all of which lead to development of social emotions and social emotion management skills. Caregivers play a vital role in this development because most of a newborn's emotional experience is tied in with that of his carer. He learns that his caregiver can make him happy and soothe his distress. The baby also learns that his emotions can exert great influence on those around him. This is the baby's first encounter with the role that emotions play in a world beyond himself. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 2.29. The fact that other astronomers, and particularly Galileo, set out to prove all of the things that Copernicus claimed helped a lot, but it was still an uphill struggle, with perhaps only a couple of dozen people agreeing with Copernicus even 100 years after his death. 100. Galileo used the newly invented telescope to show that the universe was quite different to the old-fashioned fixed notion and that there were lots of things moving about out there that could only be explained in terms of Copernicus's newfangled ideas. Not unnaturally, the Pope wasn't having any of this radical nonsense and had Galileo put under house arrest for the rest of his life. This proved that there would always be resistance to radical ideas. Over the next few hundred years, this would happen again and again. Unfortunately for the general reader, the more we learn about the universe, the more complicated it seems to get. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 2.30. Animals would have difficulty eating enough food to maintain a brain the size of the human brain. Anthropologists have theorized about humans' success in supporting such a huge brain size and the failure of other apes to do so. Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham has suggested that the discovery of fire may have fueled the eventual large size of the human brain. Harvard Richard Wrangham. With fire came the ability to cook food so that meat and tough vegetables could be softened for easier chewing and digestion, requiring less energy, an advancement that paved the way for securing enough caloric energy to maintain the impressive human brain. This advancement likely led to the eventual diminished tooth and stomach sizes so that less energy was needed to be diverted to these areas. No longer needing to chew tough vegetables hours and hours a day, the mouth may have evolved toward a structure that became more conducive to spoken language. Language also likely fueled unprecedented brain advances. Thus, our brains and associated neurocognitive functions may have expanded when our stomachs constricted. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 2.31. A striking example of the importance of doubt was the finding in 2011 that neutrinos appeared to move faster than the speed of light, discovered by timing their journey over a path from Switzerland to Italy. 2011. That observation was remarkable, for it violated everything we know about physics, especially the law that nothing can exceed the speed of light. Predictably, the first thing that the physicists, and almost every scientist, thought when hearing this report was simply, what went wrong? Although if such an observation were correct it would surely garner a Nobel Prize, one would risk a lifetime of embarrassment to publish it without substantial replication and checking. And, sure enough, immediate checks found that the neutrinos had behaved properly, and their anomalous speed was due simply to a loose cable and a faulty clock. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 2.32. Because our most urgent desires don't reach far into the future, or far beyond our homes, our intentions to display long-range empathy are usually ineffective, as scientific research on judgment now reveals. In order to close the empathy gap, we naturally employ a rule of thumb, a cognitive shortcut. We assume that others are like us. For example, in an experiment that has people read a scenario about a camper lost for several days in the wilderness, hungry people say the lost camper's dominant desire is for food. Thirsty people say it is for drink. It seems that empathy is egocentric. When deciding whom to help, people tend to assume that they are the measure of everyone else's emotional or visceral states. This shortcut is at play in some of our most cherished institutions, such as the courts. For example, it leads to biased jury verdicts that grant higher damage awards to plaintiffs residing nearby. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.33. Sometimes survey responses can be distorted through the lack of good alternative answers. For example, the Detroit area study asked the following question. Detroit. People feel differently about making changes in the way our country is run. In order to keep America great, which of these statements do you think is best? When the only two response choices were, we should be very cautious of making changes or we should be free to make changes, only 37% said that we should be free to make changes. 37%. However, when a stronger response choice was added suggesting that we should constantly make changes, 24% chose that response and another 32% still chose the free to make changes response. 24%, 32%. So instead of 37%, we now had a total of 56% who seemed open to making changes in the way our country is run. 37%, 56%. Including the more extreme positive alternative, constantly make changes, made the less extreme positive alternative more attractive. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.34. American linguist Noam Chomsky refers to language as a mirror of the mind. Noam Chomsky. Thus language is a mirror of mind in a deep and significant sense. It is a product of human intelligence, created anew in each individual by operations that lie far beyond the reach of will or consciousness. This places language beyond individual agency, and indeed Chomsky proposes the notion of universal grammar, which is an initial structure for language, deeply embedded and innately built into the human species. Chomsky. It is universal grammar which, according to Chomsky, accounts for human acquisition of language within such a short space of time. Chomsky. There is therefore a specific capacity for language within the mind, which receives and processes language from outside the mind with apparently very little difficulty. Chomsky compares the time it takes to learn one's own language fluently with the act of gaining a similarly comprehensive knowledge of physics, where the latter would take much longer because, unlike language, we are not biologically programmed to learn physics. Chomsky. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.35. The stimulus-response bond was to be the elementary unit in learning theory, akin to the role played by the atom in physics. From these fundamental units, complex understandings were thought to develop. Yet behaviorism never explained adequately how higher-order thinking abilities emerged from bonds connecting stimulus with response. In addition, it did not adequately explain how we acquire such abilities as language learning or the ability to engage in abstract conceptualization. The idea of a bond connecting stimuli with responses might have been sufficient to explain habits and reflexes, but was inadequate to explain why certain forms of prior learning create a readiness for new learning while other forms do not. As experimental evidence mounted, psychologists began searching for better explanations than behaviorism could offer. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.36. One of the primordial functions of the brain is to obtain knowledge about the world. How it does that is a problem that, today, belongs firmly in the field of neuroscience in its broadest sense. But long before neuroscience existed as a discipline, the same problem exercised philosophers. Indeed, the problem of knowledge, of how we acquire it and how certain we can be of what we know, has been a cornerstone of philosophical debate ever since the time of Plato. For Plato and his successors in the Western philosophic tradition, the problem revolved critically around the doctrine that Plato ascribed to Heraclitus, which has therefore become known as the Heraclitean doctrine of flux. In general terms, this reflects the reality that things are never the same from moment to moment. The task for the brain thus becomes one of acquiring knowledge about the essential, permanent, and constant properties of objects and situations, when the information reaching the brain is never the same from moment to moment and everything is in a continual state of flux. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.37. A trait that is often deemed a necessary ingredient of creativity is fluency. Fluency is shown when a person generates many different yet suitable responses to a stimulus within a set amount of time. It is thought that a person who is able to come up with a large number of responses has a greater chance of producing a creative response. Most common in creativity testing is ideational fluency, the ability to name things that belong to a given class. A person might, for example, be asked to name as many things as they can in 1 minute that are long. 1. While initial responses such as pole or stick may lack in originality, ideas produced later in a sequence are often more original, such as a frog's tongue. Other types of fluency include word fluency, the ability to easily state a large number of words containing a given letter, and associational fluency, the ability to easily state synonyms for a given word. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.38. Large areas of seabed in the northern Mediterranean are now carpeted by Caulerpa taxifolia, an invasive seaweed that pushes out native marine life, disrupts ecosystems, and affects fishermen's livelihoods. Caulerpa taxifolia. In the late 20th century it was very popular in the aquarium trade. 20. The public aquarium in Monaco apparently released small amounts of the seaweed into the wild. After remaining as a patch in front of the aquarium for a while, it expanded and covered the seabed along 190 kilometers of coast. 190 km. By 2001, it had spread to many other harbors around the Mediterranean on boat anchors or fishing nets. 2001. It starts out by overgrowing and shading native seaweeds or seagrasses, and then affects animals that rely on the native species for food. Animals that cannot move away quickly, such as shellfish, are smothered. This seaweed protects itself by producing a toxin, so there are relatively few species that can eat it. One species that does is the Mediterranean bream, which accumulates the toxins but is not directly harmed. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.39. The Industrial Revolution must be characterized as an evolutionary and emergent development. Since various developments contributed to the Industrial Revolution, there is no single development or innovation that can be considered as the prime driving force behind the Industrial Revolution. However, the advancement of machines and tooling that enabled the development of machines for producing goods appears most significant. The innovation of the steam-driven machine by Thomas Newcomen was followed later by the rotating steam engine of James Watt, which made the powering of many production machines in factories possible. Thomas Newcomen, James Watt. This also made possible the large-scale factory-oriented production of goods. Consequently, many enterprises emerged in areas such as textiles, gas, mining, oil refinery, transport, train and ship, and communication, telegraph. Construction of roads and canals made concentrated factory production of goods possible at locations distant from those where products were eventually used or where the basic raw or production materials were available. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.40. Interpretation in the context of literary studies can be defined as the methodologically reflected procedure we employ in order to understand a literary text. As such, interpretation is a response to the experience of textual complexity. In our everyday lives we are surrounded by information that is self-evident in the sense of being semantically transparent to such a degree that there is no need for a sustained effort of understanding. However, such self-evidence is rare in literature. Whether due to the historical or cultural distance that separates authors from readers or to the difficulty of literary language itself, the literary text tends to meet us with a certain degree of foreignness that sometimes makes us give up in frustration, but more often stimulates our curiosity and encourages further investigation. It is ultimately this encounter with incomprehensibility, which is central to the reading of literary texts, that forces us to reflect on the questions of interpretation and understanding. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 2.4142. If we show babies a sphere that moves in a straight line, jumps over a wall, then heads to the right, little by little, they will get bored of it. Are they simply getting used to this peculiar motion? No, in fact, they understand much more. They deduce that this is an animate being with a specific intention, it wants to move to the right. Moreover, they can tell the object is highly motivated, because it jumps over a high wall in order to get there. Now let's remove the wall. In this scenario, babies are not surprised if they see the sphere change its motion and move to the right in a straight line, without jumping. This is simply the best way to attain its goal. On the other hand, babies open their eyes wide if the sphere continues to jump in the air for no particular reason, since the wall has vanished. In the absence of a wall, the same trajectory as in the first scenario leaves the babies surprised, because they do not understand what strange intention the sphere might have. Other experiments show that children routinely infer people's intentions and preferences. In particular, they understand that the higher the wall is, the greater the person's motivation must be in order to jump over it. From their observations, babies can infer not only the goals and intentions of those around them, but also their beliefs, abilities, and preferences. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 2.4345. One day someone told Tom of a farmer nearby who fed some native birds. Tom. Much interested in the success he heard this man had in taming wild birds, Tom visited the farmer one cold January morning. Tom had walked only partway up the farmhouse's snow-covered driveway when he heard a flutter of wings. Tom. Before he realized what was happening, a chickadee alighted on his shoulder. Filled with wonder at this experience, Tom stood still, not daring to move. Tom. The tiny bird looked up into his face, a question clearly showing in its beady black eyes. Suddenly a man spoke. Take some of these peanuts. Blackie wants to be fed. Blackie. Tom moved slightly and the chickadee flew from his shoulder to the woolen cap of the ruddy-faced farmer who stood by a tree near his house a few yards away. Tom. Here. He tossed his human visitor a handful of shelled peanuts. Put half a kernel on your lower lip and don't move. Tom did as he was told and Blackie the chickadee came flying directly for his face. Tom Blackie. As the little bird neared him it swooped downward, then up. Tom felt a slight tickling of his face as the bird's feet touched his chin, the momentary clasp of its claws as it gently pecked the peanut from his lips, and then the light flutter of its wings as it flew up to the branch of a tree to eat its prize. Tom. The farmer's grin showed Tom how astonished he looked. Tom. It was the first time that Tom had ever had a wild bird come to him with no more fear than if he were a tree or a bush. Tom has never forgotten the thrill of that experience and what it taught him about the trust that he can instill in a wild creature by showing it patience, kindness, and understanding. Tom. Since that day he has had many chickadees and other kinds of songbirds come to his hands to feed. He believes that everyone who feeds birds should make it their goal to gain the trust of at least one wild bird at their feeder, or feeders, so that it will come to them, to their children, and to their guests for food. MTC. Good job.